Hey everyone and welcome. We're in my wormery, and if all goes well today, we're going to be taking this bin of mine right here, which was dated on February 26th, which means it's been in action since then. That's exactly 199 days ago, because today is September the 13th, Friday the 13th. And after 199 days, this bin has been, it's been through a number of what's known as horizontal migrations, trying to sweep the population of worms through the material back and forth a number of times to make sure that they thoroughly compost all the material in the bin. And then it was, I don't know, I'm not even sure, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago that I set up this final horizontal migration in order to encourage the worms to depopulate what I think is at this point finished compost. And you know, it's not perfect. It's got some little uncomposted scraps of leaf in here and there, but you know, I'm not trying to create a commercial product here. I think what I've got here is perfectly fine for my purposes, which is just, you know, me gardening in my backyard. What I've got going on here now is a final stage of wanting to extract the worms out of this feeding zone. I mean, for that matter, I'm simply going to empty this feeding zone as is, with whatever bedding material is in here, with whatever compost they've produced while eating what's in this feeding zone, and obviously bring all the worms out of here as well, with the intention of leaving behind only compost. So at that point, it's nothing more than scooping it out of this container and placing it into a bucket such as this for storage. I could be taking it just as easily straight out into the garden to be planting plants with it, or to creating a nice top dressing around my existing plants. But for now, for the purposes of this video, all we're doing now is bringing closure to this 199-day-old bin by extracting the worms, harvesting the compost, and then in the very end, we're going to give this bin a quick rinse, set it up from scratch, and relaunch those worms that were extracted from the bin into a fresh new bin. Slap on a new sticker with today's date to indicate that this is now a fresh bin starting today. Here on my bench are a number of different things. I've already set up the space to work, and what you see in front of you are the things that I'm going to be using. Doesn't mean this is the only way to build a bin. It's just the way that I'm going to go about doing it. But let me just give you a quick rundown on what's here. Every good worm bin needs some sort of bedding material, and that's usually like a carbon type based material such as paper or cardboard. And for that purpose, I've got a whole bunch of shredded cardboard here. And similarly, what I have here is a bunch of leaf collected with my leaf bagger. So it's semi-chopped up dry leaves. And all of this stuff is the type of material that I generally use as bedding in my bins. And after I've laid down a nice, comfortable layer of bedding on the bottom of my new bin, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put in some nice, delectable food items for them. In this case, we're going to be giving them a hunk of watermelon and a number of banana peels. And you could see a little bit of condensation developing on these. These came out of the freezer a little while ago, so they're thawing out. But it's believed that freezing their food before giving it to them, number one, makes sure that there's no little pests or creepy crawlies living in or on the food that you're giving your worms. And the fact that it's been frozen and is thawing also enables the food to break down more readily so that the worms can access it and eat it much more quickly. Now, another organic material that's found in most homes is coffee grinds, and what you're seeing in here are the actual filters for the coffee grinds, and down within the container is a whole bunch of coffee grinds, a few days worth of coffee grinds out of the coffee machine. So that'll also be part of the food that they're getting, combined with a very important ingredient that you never want to forget when you're feeding your worms, which is grit. And this grit is, it could be pulverized oyster shells, it could be straight sand, as long as it's not salty or contaminated, or what you see here, which is ground up eggshells. And a lot of people like to boil them first just to make sure there's no chance of any sort of salmonella or any sort of diseases being carried from the eggshells into your worm bins. So those are the basic ingredients that I'm going to use. And you might also see over here is my water bottle. And I might actually soak some of the cardboard before I place it into my new bin, just to make sure that the new environment for the worms is not too dry when we release them. And I usually like to use a fair amount of leaf matter on the top of my bin as well. So you'll see how all that goes when I build the bin prior to releasing the worms into it. But I just wanted to give you a quick rundown on what I'm going to be using to build my bin. Here I have a container I'm going to be using to temporarily hold the worms while I'm harvesting their castings. So they'll just be sitting in this bin temporarily. And I got this bin over here that I could use to drench the cardboard prior to using it in my build. So that's the reason for these couple containers over here. All right, why don't we get to work? All right, so here you see this divider, which actually reached all the way to the bottom, but chances are it's been eaten up by the worms as they either made their way through it or under it or around it. So it's not of much use anymore, so it'll just go into the bin also as part of the new environment for them, as part of their bedding. So it'll be extracted as well. And I'm just going to be curious to see how many worms are still hanging out on the edge, because the idea here was that the worms all make their way into here. So the hope is that there's little or no worms left in this part of the bin. Now, to make this a little bit easier, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to cover up the compost one more time, just so I can place my temporary holding bin right here, right alongside the feeding zone that the worms are in presently. And this will just make it a little bit easier for me to simply lift them up and drop them right into here without having to spill it all over the place and onto my bench and everywhere. So I'm not going to go crazy prepping for this. I'm just going to start right into the extraction of the worms, 1, 2, 3, and just scoop them right out. Let's get this up on top and see how things look in between. Definitely not seeing too many worms right on the perimeter, and that's kind of what I was hoping for. It would seem that most of the worms have made their way over into the new space. Let's just go ahead and get them out of here. Should only take a few scoops to extract them all. I'll try to do it in a way that we could see how many worms we're dealing with here. That looks like a pretty good sign, though. It does seem like we've got a fair number of them. And it's worth mentioning also that I have already extracted an equal number of worms in one previous extraction of the horizontal feeding zone a couple weeks ago. So whatever number of worms we end up with here, we've already extracted just about as many in a previous session just like this. And I guess if we had felt that there was still a fair number of worms remaining in the finished compost or nearly finished compost, then what we would have actually done here was set up a fresh new cardboard barrier. And then I would have just, instead of giving them a fresh new space to live in a new bin, or a fresh bin, I would have simply rebuilt this feeding zone for them and given the bin enough time to completely evacuate and allow the worms to really make their way out of the finished compost entirely. It definitely looks like we've got ourselves a fair number of worms down in this material here. And each time we bring them over, they're not very fond of the bright light overhead, so naturally they're going to squirm right down into the material. So we only get to glance at them for a few seconds before they all vanish down into the compost or down into the bedding. This is kind of a compost bedding mix still. It's not entirely broken down yet. because it is a fairly freshly built feeding zone. But as you see, as I'm scooping all this out, you see little scraps of bedding type material, which is leaves and cardboard and stuff like that. But the food items that I had used to build this horizontal migration feeding zone over here are all gone. They were all green type vegetables, and I did not see any sign of anything resembling the food that they'd been given. And that was 10 days ago, so that kind of makes sense that they would have polished off that much food in that much time. It is interesting because I did mention earlier that that horizontal feeding zone was more or less a fresh environment built up for them to encourage them to work their way out of the compost. So not only did they eat it all, but they were also quite capable of making their way over into it, detecting that it was there, making their way into it, and consuming all of the food laid out for them in that section to try to draw them out of this finished compost. I just figured I would take a quick peek along the very edge here to see how many worms didn't really make it all the way over into the feeding zone. Here and there I see one or two. If I can snag them, I will. Here's one. And I'll just toss them over into the temporary holding bin that their cousins are all in. So here and there I'm finding a couple, but you know, in my opinion, leaving a few worms in your compost is not the end of the world. The compost is not going to be 100% broken down, so they won't starve. They'll have stuff to eat in this if they remain in here. And I think since they reproduce based not only on available space but also available food, so if they start to sense that there's a diminishing amount of available food in this bin or in this material, they'll sort of taper off on the reproduction, and you know, we won't have to worry about a fresh generation of worms being born into this material only to starve because of an absence of food. Especially if the compost is headed straight out into the garden, because if it is, then the garden only benefits from having these little guys out there to help aerate the earth. So I'm just poking around a little bit here, just a few more rescue jobs, but I'm not going to go crazy trying to extract worms here. So we can just grab a few of them as we spot them. But like I said, I'm not going to sweat it. I'm going to just go ahead and leave them be, whichever ones I don't scoop out. And they'll just continue to break down the material in this bin to make it a really nice finished product. Because this stuff won't be used right away. I believe it will sit here in storage for a little while at least. Now, one thing that we observed in this bin was that the material had been a bit damp. And that was the reason I wasn't really going too crazy trying to keep it covered tight. I was hoping for a chance to let the material air out a little bit and dry, and I think that we've more or less accomplished that, because if you look at the texture and the way this material behaves when you kind of crumble it between your fingers, it does break apart quite readily. It doesn't seem to have that sort of muddy, sticky quality that it had a few weeks ago, so I'm glad that that's the way the stuff looks now. It's kind of the way I was hoping that it would be before I put it away into storage. I just can't seem to resist trying to scoop these little worms out as I spot them. But I think I'm done. I think I'm ready to take this material and put it into my holding bucket and just put it on the shelf and let it sit. Now, another important factor to consider when you're storing your finished compost is to not seal it up, not to put the lid on tight. Make sure it remains aerated. I made the mistake with one of my early harvests of vermicompost was to put the lid on the container. Actually, it wasn't intentional. The lid just sort of closed on its own. It's actually the container that we're going to be using now, and it's got this crazy hinge on it. And I had actually propped up the container lid to remain open to keep the material aerated, but it snapped shut, closed up enough to prevent airflow, and unfortunately all the worms that were still lingering in the material died, and that normally wouldn't be a problem because they would just die and decompose over time gradually, but they all suffocated in a very short period of time. They all surfaced trying to escape, and then they all continued to sit there on the surface after they died and rot away and create a horrible stench within that container. So I don't even remember what I did with that stuff. I don't think I planted anything very important in that. I might have just used that material as some sort of fill out in my garden just to plug up a hole or whatever. And it was really just out of carelessness that it happened. So just be careful. Don't let that happen to you. So now I'm just going to position my container over here and begin scooping it out. I'm just going to use my hands. Seems like the easiest way to do it. So let's get it out of here and move it over. This stuff is really nice. It's got such a good earthy smell to it, nice and fresh. Moisture level seems almost perfect. Maybe a little more damp than I'm used to, but I think what I'm used to is too dry. So if it's a little more damp than I'm used to, then that's probably just right. Okay, I'm going to do what I can to try to get the last of these little bits of compost dislodged from these crevices and these little features on the bottom of the bin. But from looking around, I believe I've actually extracted the last of the worms. I saw one or two worms still squirming around here and there, and I got them out. And there's really very little compost left in here other than the scraps that have kind of dried to the wall of the bin and little bits here and there, but not enough to worry about. I think this bin is ready to be rinsed off, have the old label peeled off, and then we'll refit it and get it ready for the worms to occupy it and start from scratch. Start all over in a fresh bin. So we'll set this aside briefly, and we'll just check out what we ended up with. It's about halfway up this container, and if this is maybe a 5-gallon container, then we've yielded maybe somewhere between 2 and 3 gallons of nice rich vermicompost. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to take care in not allowing this bin to close up and become a sealed environment like I did once upon a time in the past. So I'm just going to make sure that this remains aerated so that the material always has a fresh supply of air so as not to get funky that way. The bin is spick and span. I've peeled off the label and it's ready for use. So let's build it up and get these worms a new fresh habitat that they can move into. So we're going to start with these cardboard scraps. You might remember I put them in this bin so that I can take my watering can and drop in a little bit of water. Now this water is not straight out of the tap. I mean, it is straight out of the tap, but it did sit in my watering can for some time to let all the chlorine sort of flash off and evaporate, because the water in my area, I don't know about you, but the water in my area is very chloriney. So before I use it in my worm bins, I like to try to give it a little bit of time to air out and allow the chlorine in the water to evaporate away for a few days before I use the water in my bins. Although, personally, I very rarely add water or use water in my bins. Situations like this are the few occasions when I do, when I want to take material that's overly dry and dampen it before using it in my worm bins, and in other similar situations. But for the most part, I don't really add water to my bins. I always feel like the food that I'm adding always seems to bring with it a fair amount of moisture, and keeps the moisture levels in my bins suitable for the worms to remain nice and comfortable and cozy. I'm just going to go ahead and let it drain off into one corner like so. Then I'll just go ahead and start scooping the cardboard out and place it into my new worm bin. Ready? In addition to the cardboard, scraps of cardboard, I'm also going to sprinkle in some leaf matter and mix it together. This stuff is dry, but I think combined they're going to create a nice moisture level that the worms should find comfortable. I was hoping for a little bit more depth, so why don't we just put in some more, leaf matter. Alright, maybe not what I was anticipating, maybe a little bit more than I had hoped for, but it's fine. I guess since we've got a fair amount of liquid left over, maybe I'll just take some of this leafy matter and give it a little bit of a soak too, as long as it's readily available. And since the leafy matter is rather dry, it seems like a good idea just to try to dampen it as well, the same way we dampen the cardboard. Alright, I think that'll be just fine. So once again, I'm going to let the water drain and I'll scoop out the material. And we'll just spread everything around nicely within the bin here for them. Now you're going to notice it's not terribly deep at all. I would say no more than maybe a half an inch to an inch deep throughout. So it's not a very big environment that I'm starting them out in. It doesn't have to be deep. This is perfectly fine for them. They're going to be content in this. And we can move right on to inserting the food items. Now, I suppose I could have chopped up this piece of watermelon into little pieces, but it's going to be just fine putting it in as one whole piece. It'll be fun to observe how the material breaks down over time and how the worms eat it, how quickly they eat it. So I'll be curious to see how long it takes for them to nibble that down, but it shouldn't take long at all. They're usually quite fond of watermelon and eat it quite rapidly. So all I did there was I took the banana peels and spread them around. So I've got a pretty good even layer of bedding on top of which I've placed food materials. But you also want to remember that everything that I've got in here as bedding, the cardboard and the newspaper and the leafy matter, is all just as edible to them as this fruity food. But I like to try to give them a good mix. The one thing I guess you want to be careful of is, just like if you're building a compost pile outside, when you take carbon-rich materials, then you also take nitrogen-rich materials, such as these food scraps, there is always that potential that those materials combined will start generating heat like they do in an outdoor compost pile. Hopefully, at this scale, it's not going to be a problem and it's not going to happen. But sometimes people do experience that, and it results in the worms trying to flee the container. So I don't think that we're at risk of having that happen here, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. But I just wanted to mention it because it is something that can actually happen. And sometimes people wonder, why are my worms fleeing? Well, it is possible that that's the reason. So another food item that I like to add is the coffee grinds. And just like the paper and the cardboard that's in here, the coffee grinds that we use on a daily basis when we prepare our coffee are just as edible to the worms. So those go in here too. They're no different from the rest of the carbon-rich materials that we're feeding them. It's just another form of paper that they're going to be happy to consume over time. And then comes the coffee grinds. The coffee grinds is also a fairly nitrogen-rich material. So we're, again, inserting the ingredients for potentially a hot composting situation, but like I said earlier, in these amounts, I don't think we have much to worry about. Now, on to the grit. The grit is, in my case, pulverized eggshell, but the main purpose of the grit is for the worms to have the ability to digest the food that they're eating. Their digestion system is not like ours. They don't have acid in their stomachs. Their digestion system is much more like that of a bird or like a chicken. It's a gizzard, and the way it pulverizes the food is that the food goes down into the gizzard, but into the gizzard also goes grit. So as they eat, they combine the grit and the food that they're eating, and the gizzard is really just a muscular sort of an organ that grinds the two together, and it's that way that the food gets broken down mechanically instead of chemically the way it does in our stomach. So the grit's really important, especially for baby worms, because baby worms are born with no means to break down the food that they eat. So they need grit in order to have their first meals. Adult worms, I'm not sure if the grit remains in their systems or if it just goes out the other end with the food that they eat. So I always, or at least nowadays, I try to be a little bit more generous with the grit. In the past, I used to be a little bit more stingy with the grit, but nowadays I'm a lot more generous with it, and I do believe that it helps increase the speed of the breakdown of the food that they're eating. Okay, so now one last ingredient that I normally like to include is a little bit more leafy matter. All my newest bins are very easily recognizable because they're usually topped off with a whole bunch of leafy matter. And then over time, that leafy matter all gets eaten just like the rest of the food in their bins. And that's also, to me, kind of an indicator of how things are going in that bin. If there's still a lot of leafy matter scattered across the top of my bins, then it means to me that the composting action in that bin is not moving along as quickly as it could be. So, since I can still see a little sign here and there of the food lying right beneath, there's some of the coffee, there's one of the banana peels, there's another of the banana peels. And since there was still a little bit of water left in this green container, I figured I would just soak up the last of the water and use a little bit more leaf matter to try to really cover up the food that's in this bin. So let's get that in here as well. Yeah, I think that's a perfect amount right there. And I believe after we release them, we're probably going to even throw a little bit more leafy matter on top just as a cover. We won't soak that, we'll just pour it in dry. And that'll just be to cover up this material that the worms came over in, because this also has some food scraps left in it from the last feeding. But there's really nothing to it in terms of releasing the worms. I'm just going to go ahead and invert this container and dump its entire contents out into the new habitat for the worms. And then the worms will just gradually make their way into the bin, make themselves at home. But luckily they've still got this this material that they've been in for some time now, so they should feel pretty comfortable, and they can stay in this as long as they want until they feel comfortable enough to wander and explore and check out the rest of the bin. So, all right, let's release the worms. All right, this was really going to become bedding, so let's try to just shove this down low, and then we'll just sort of spread out what we have here a little bit. Try to spread it out level and evenly. It'll also give us sort of a sense of how many worms we're launching off with here. I'm never good at guessing how many worms we have in a scenario like this. So I'm always imagining that they're kind of jumbled up in certain spots or hidden or out of view. But if I had to guess, I would have to say there's got to be at least a 1,000, or at least 1,000, no? I don't know. What's your guess? What do you think? Put it in the comments. Let me know what you think in terms of how many worms we just launched off there. And you see they don't stick around for long. They don't like the bright light, so they go squirming right down into the material, 1, 2, 3. So hopefully we've given them a nice, comfortable environment to cozy up to. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so like I said before, I always like to top off my new bins with a nice cover of just leafy matter all around the top. Sort of a barrier to keep any sort of overhead flying insects from gaining any interest in what's going on down underneath. And it's also kind of a gauge for me to see how things are progressing. My very new bins like this one are usually very leafy on the top, and as they get more mature, the leaf cover becomes less and less over time. All right, everyone. Well, that's about it for today. I hope you enjoyed my harvesting of my oldest bin ever, 199 days. Wanted to get that done before it hit the 200 mark, so I'm glad I did. And I'm also really happy to see that the horizontal migration went as easily as it did. It was kind of a relief to not have to use my old sifter and try to use the bright overhead lights to sort of drive the worms down into the material in order for me to scoop off the castings from the top and gather it that way. So this was a sort of a time saver. Even though I didn't really do it as quickly as I could, I wanted to just kind of explain what was happening just for the benefit of anyone who might be watching this sort of a thing for the first time and trying to get some experience. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then always, like I always ask, please remember to give my video a thumbs up. Showing that you like it is really appreciated, and it's also really appreciated if you sign up to become a subscriber to the channel. This way, if you also ring the bell when you do so, you'll get notifications from YouTube letting you know that one of my new videos have just come online, so you can check it out when it's brand new. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.